Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 28, Structures of Organizations. All right, recall lecture 27 was a bonus lecture on becoming more motivated. And we talked about the importance of knowing yourself and negotiating with yourself, how to hack yourself, and transform yourself. Well, today we're starting chapter 10, and this is about the organization of the organization, and we're going to talk about structures today. So we're going to talk about organizational hierarchies and networks and processes. And then we're going to talk about bureaucracy versus autonomy. We're going to talk about achieving flexibility and autonomy. And we're going to talk about teams and organizations, and then we'll end it with formal and informal hierarchies. All right, organizational hierarchies, networks, and processes. What are those things? Any organization will have formal and informal structures, and we'll talk about what we mean by that. You'll have formalized hierarchies, networks, processes, and policy. So in this case, formalized means explicit. Well, in all cases, explicitly recognized, or authorized, or credentialed, overtly supported or funded, or otherwise just made clearly manifest as a needed and endorsed part of the organization. So there's a lot in there, but hopefully you understand that this is a thing that could be a hierarchy. So like, here's who's in charge of whatever, and here's the reporting structure, or it could be a network. These are the group of people responsible for X, Y, and Z, or it could be a process. This is the way we make French fries, or whatever. But when it's like written down or explicit, well-known, authorized, those are the things that would be called formalized in terms of the parts of the organization. But you also have informal things, and you can have informal hierarchies, which is to say, you kind of know like who's really responsible for whatever, and who kind of goes to that person. You have various ways that hierarchies can emerge outside of like direct authority. And then you have lots of informal networks where there's just a group of people that know each other, and they all have the same problems, or they have the same interest, or they have the same background, or whatever. And then there's informal processes, which is, this is the way this is the way we really make the fries. This is how we do stuff, and everybody kind of knows it, and we've never actually written it down, or most people know it once they've been here long enough, but we don't really describe it or classify it or bother to try to formalize it. And then in both of these cases, things like policy, which is like rules. You can have very formalized rules, and you can have lots of informal rules, and hopefully this is making sense. So, but when it's informal, that could mean it's explicit, which is to say you have an informal rule that people know and recognize and can explain. Like, well, there's no rule that says you absolutely can't take your lunch from 12:30 to 1:30, but really everybody takes it from noon to 1. And if you took it from 12:30 to 1:30, it'd be it'd create problems with how we schedule meetings and all of that. But I mean, technically you're allowed to do that. But I mean, nobody does that. I mean, that would be like an informal rule that you can explain. That's explicit. And then there's the implicit, which is the way people do stuff. Whether it's that was a policy or a rule base, but again, networks, hierarchies, processes, and policies, all these things can be ways you can look at how an organization structures itself. You can have them implicit, which is to say people kind of know there's norms that you can describe, and there's norms that you just sort of know. There's networks of people that they aren't an official group. They can't even really explain it because nobody's ever made the effort to try to say, hey, all these people, they all interact in this dimension. So anyway, hopefully this makes sense, that there's things that the organization can recognize, will formally recognize, or at least acknowledge, and then there's things that are just unrecognized, as in nobody acknowledges that they exist, even though people might be able to explain them. And then there's times when people never really have recognized them or can explain them. So implicit and explicit is different than recognized and than unrecognized. This bullet point won't be on the test. Okay. Another little bonus nugget here for people that choose to watch the videos instead of just looking at the notes. I'll try to give you some more information as the lectures go on of stuff that's not going to be on the test. But this bullet, don't worry if it's confusing, but I'll quit trying to explain it and move on. In technology itself, the tools you use, the automated software you use, if it's a factory, what a production line looks like. The constraints of that technology impose their own structures. That now there used to be typing pools. There used to be a lot of process and networks and hierarchies all around allowing for an organization to communicate. And now a CEO can send an email. Directly and receive them directly. Even usually large corporations that have CEOs have ways in which they manage that, so they don't deal with 1,000 people talking to them at the same time. But that modern communication convenience of computers and the internet and email, it has radically transformed an organization's structure around communication and access, for example. So you can look at, you can slice and dice this lots of ways if you just pick an era and describe the kind of technology that existed at the time. But a lot of it is generally moved by something got automated. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. And then teams themselves, within an organization, they have their own structure. So you've got a team that all works on a certain thing. You inevitably end up with structure, and that structure can be based on like the team's function. Like it's a project team, and we all work on designing this particular product. And that function, what is this team's job? That itself can result in natural structures that make the most sense. But also who's in the team composition. Can often result in natural structures. And then individuals often self-impose a structure. And what do I mean by structure? It can mean lots of stuff, but the way you do things, how things are communicated, the order by which you do things, and your habits themselves, end up as anchors to your behaviors. And so you always take care of a certain thing right away in the morning. You put off dealing with the difficult stuff to the end of the day, but you look at what you have every morning. Well, if that's the case, then if you do that every day, that'll create a behavior, and that'll be its own kind of imposed structure. So that actual individual behavior, how you do your work, even if you are part of if you're just an individual and this is how you work and you work a certain way, you'll still end up causing some level of imposition of structure onto the team that you're working with, that you're a part of, the people that depend upon you. If you only ever do the hard stuff at the end of the day, or let's say you do the difficult stuff right away in the morning, those are two different. Let's use a different example. How about if you get emails overnight, or you wake up in the morning and you look at what are things that maybe came in, and if you deal with responding right away, that the people that you're working with will then move on with whatever they need to do from your information right away in the morning. But if you wait till the end of the day, they'll do other stuff, and they just sort of work around that workday lag. So kind of beating this to death here, but hopefully what you see is the way you work ends up creating structure, ways of behaving that affects how other people work. So anyway, that's enough about organizational hierarchies, networks, and processes. Let's talk about bureaucracy versus autonomy. What is this bureaucracy term? Bureaucracy was a term coined by Max Weber. Initially, a bureaucracy was meant to be benevolent, or at least it was meant to be a thing that meant efficiency and good things. And it's become a term that's generally now used to describe when something is cumbersome and Byzantine and overly detailed and heavy-handed and that sort of thing. But initially, it was a thing that during the Industrial Revolution and some of the excesses, the pathologies associated with the Industrial Revolution, where there was a lot of inequality, there's a lot of cruelty, there's a lot of favoritism. There's a certain person's son would always get a certain job, and there was a lot of sort of nepotism and a lot of class stuff, and this is sort of akin to Taylorism, which came along a little bit later, but this is about defining a structure in which the organization is set up, and it was initially intended as a way to resolve what was considered some negative attributes of early capitalism in the Industrial Revolution. And so this approach is then aligned with theory X. Remember McGregor's theory X and Y. And the theory X is a little bit more is sort of the Taylorism versus the theory Y is more of the human relations era, or focusing just on the task, versus acknowledging the reality that there's humans involved and that humans are complicated. So anyway, so this is sort of the rigid way in which you define work, and people are cogs, for better or for worse. And along with bureaucracy, this is just how to formalize the organization and formalize who does what and those sorts of things. So one of the clearest ways it was manifest is by just sort of defining this is the chart that says who's responsible for what and who reports to who. And so the first org chart, at least classically org chart, I mean, you could probably argue that all sorts of military structures have had org charts for millennia. But the first known, what would now be considered an organizational chart associated with modern organizations was in the 1850s, created by Daniel McCollum as part of the New York and Erie Railroad organization. And part of bureaucracy and having org charts is breaking stuff into who's responsible for what, and breaking the organization into parts. So you've got a big factory, and you're making things, and you're receiving in stuff that you use to make your products, and you're shipping them out, and you have various steps along the way. Well, you slice and dice your organization based upon those steps, for instance, and you build an org chart around those steps. So your operations, what are the parts of the organization? You decentralize it into that and how you're defining it. Another part of bureaucracy is you define who gets to make decisions. You define where the authority is, where the decision rights lie, and you create a way in which everybody knows this is, if you want to get something approved, this is the form you fill out, and this is the person you go to, and then they have to approve it. And if they approve it, then they go up to their boss or this person who's responsible for this the spend in this area. And so you define what that process is, and you define who has the authority to make those decisions. And then typically in a classic bureaucracy, you have top-down decision making. And so the authority, rests at the top, and then the responsibility to get the work done then gets delegated downward. So it's a top-down organization. So this by itself is something that ignores human values. So that doesn't mean it's inherently always manifesting in a malevolent way. It just means it ends up being agnostic to the reality of the people involved. And so sometimes it can be quite functional, and sometimes it can be just sort of a horror show in terms of people. And so it really looks this from a Taylorism view, which is that people take orders. People are the person involved in this is a cog, and you give them the orders, they do the orders. It's sort of that's the base assumption of this, and we know by now that that's inadequate, and that creates issues. And so the human relations movement was a response to the original Taylorism, and the human relations movement and theory Y from McGregor's theory X and Y looked at, hey, we need managers that are actually, involved in what the people are doing and how they're feeling and what their motivation is. We need ways in which the people are participatory in decision making, that things are more collaborative, that we take into account how people feel and the complexity of humans. So you end up with a balance. So the theory Y kind of balances the theory X. The human relations balances the bureaucracy or the sort of scientific management aspect of things. So the what you are doing gets balanced by the how you do it. So these are reoccurring themes that we've been hearing throughout this semester. And so that human relations movement led to an environment where you have more flexibility, more autonomy at the employee level, which led to greater motivation and better well-being. And so you end up today in a typical modern organization with a balance of this, when things are working well, with a level of bureaucracy, predictive structure, clear decision making around most things, but you also have levels of autonomy, levels of flexibility that allow for agency at the working level. And you're trying to balance that, maximally motivate people, but at the same time keep people aligned. The bureaucracy is a way in which you keep everybody pointed in the same direction. Because again, a highly aligned team of average people often will exceed a bunch of super performers that can't ever agree on how to work together. So hopefully you get a sense here of why these things need to be nested together or entangled and balanced between imposed structure and of autonomy to take action. All right, so let's dig into this flexibility and autonomy a little bit more, and what organizations can do to try to achieve this and effectively balance out the more sort of rigid, stifling effects of the imposed order of bureaucracy. So the big way is basically allowing an employee to have some amount or a lot of self-management, where an employee has responsibility to their own goals, and an employee is actually responsible for managing their own behaviors. This requires that you're able to monitor yourself. This requires that you're actually able to change your performance. This means that an employee must be their own reinforcing mechanism to get their work done. You need to be able to kick yourself and motivate yourself. Pay attention to how you're doing. You do this right now as a student. There's a certain amount of, say, bureaucracy imposed upon it. I mean, the tests, unit test 4 has a date to it, and it needs to be done. And you need to achieve a certain level of performance on it. But I'm not telling you in this case when you have to read this lecture or watch me, and I'm not going to be telling you how you're going to or be there when you're going to do efforts to recall and organize your stuff and be prepared for the test. Those are all things you have to self-manage. So even a modern schooling environment is this balance of imposed structure and self-management. And as you go further up in education, when you're, say, kindergarten, you get a little bit more structure because there's really not a whole lot of capability of self-management. And as you mature and then enter the workforce, typically it's a progression of that. Now, if you work at a factory and you're on the production line, there is a great deal of constraint imposed upon you just simply because there's a manufacturing line that needs to be cared for, fed, or participated in, and so can be a lot of structural structural constraints that are their own kind of imposition, the way a bureaucracy can be an imposition. So hopefully you get a sense here for this balance between order and self-management. Now, in this modern environment where employees have some or a lot of self-management, a leader's job then, instead of a purely bureaucratic top-down organization of telling you where to move and what to do and what to do next, leaders of self-managed organizations, their job is to make sure that the environment itself is conducive to that self-management, and to some extent to make sure that the people are capable of self-managing. A lot of times when somebody gets, say, fired or demoted or otherwise steps are taken by the organization to dramatically improve their performance or get them out of the organization, a lot of times that could literally be due to poor self-management. It isn't so much that you didn't want to get the work done, but you may have actually been incapable of organizing yourself and holding yourself to account to get the work done. And you might be fired because you failed to get the work done. But I mean, really think about it. You could look at it as you got fired for having poor self-management. And you could say the same thing if you got poor grades. In some cases, maybe it's because the domain knowledge that you had is inadequate for the level of the stretch to the new domain knowledge. But it could be because you had poor self-management, and that's actually what you need to focus on. So interesting things to think about. Interesting way to frame the modern work environment in terms of degrees of self-management. And then to some extent, organizations often have self-managed work teams, which is you get a team of people working together, which is the norm and not the exception. You often have the team has a certain amount of decision rights the team can work on. And now some cases it can be quite formalized that, hey, this is the work team, and the team gets to determine the order of the work and who's assigned to what, and even bringing on new resources and how to train them and that sort of thing. I mean, you can truly have, you can formalize this notion of self-managed teams. But even if you don't, it's informally in existence in every work environment, at least to some extent. And the degree to which a team can manage itself is very similar to the degree to which a person can manage themselves. It is dependent upon the maturity, the discipline, the way in which people take on responsibility. So a mature and responsible team is composed of mature and responsible team members. And that conversion process to go from a group of people that maybe don't know what they're supposed to be doing, maybe has a degree of immaturity in their ability to work together, transitioning that over time to get to where the team is as a whole mature and responsible. That can be a difficult process, non-trivial process, especially when you're bringing on new people, especially if those people themselves maybe have self-management challenges themselves. So the degree to which you can allow for and then get the benefit from the motivated state that comes from autonomy. Okay, when you let people be free and able to make their own decisions, that's usually the way you can tap into the maximum motivation of a person. But if that person can't orient towards the goals of the organization, then it will fail. And so the degree to which you can allow autonomy and get the benefit from it is directly proportional to the shared goals and the maturity, if you will, of the person. And the same goes at the team level. So when you have a partially or fully self-managed team, you still have an organization that the team is part of. That organization then needs to make sure that that the team is given clear direction and goals. That the team has sufficient resources to get its job done, and that would be people as well as other things, depending on what the team is responsible for. And then the managers that are associated with this team need to be supportive of that team, and there's still leadership required. I mean, you still need to assess. Okay, is this team mature? Is this team responsible? To what extent is this team showing that it can make its own decisions? And then, if you don't want it all to go to hell, you need to know when it's time to step in a little bit and impose a little external structure onto a team. Okay, so that should give you some background of flexibility and autonomy in terms of the decisions people can make. But there's another thing that should be brought in for consideration too about the way organizations are structured, especially post-COVID. There's lots of ways now that people can work together, and the dramatic acceleration in remote work in the workplace has been immense, and it doesn't appear that there's any going back. Now, that isn't to say that every workplace is a remote workplace, but the notion pre-COVID was that remote work was a rare thing, and now post-COVID, it's like remote work is like an option in lots and lots of cases, and there's lots of now people that are insisting on it. And if when organizations can't be selective because they can't find enough people otherwise, they have to give in to that. So hybrid flex arrangements, remote work arrangements, creative and alternative ways in which people can collaborate is the new normal. All right, let's talk about teams inside organizations. So the way a team is structured, at least the way it should be properly structured, it depends on things. It depends on to what extent does the task the team that needs to work on, or say the deliverable, which is sometimes sort of the same thing. The task is usually the stuff you got to do to get to the deliverable. But how the team needs to be structured to perform well often depends upon sort of interdependence of the work that you're doing to the outcome. If you've got a team that everybody needs to do their part, but if everybody does their part, they just put it together and there it's done, that's the outcome. You don't need to have much structure because there isn't too much interdependence other than everybody's got to do their part. But sometimes you have, let's say everybody's working on a computer program, and people have it in different parts, but the whole thing has to work together. There's a lot of interdependencies in there where people have, I think I have skeleton of what I want to do, but I got to see if it works with your part, and we got to do this testing, and we need to co-develop this part. So you can end up having to have a structure that needs a lot more communication. That has to have a lot more handoffs, that has to have a lot more communication, so I know what you're doing so that I can arrange my stuff so it fits when you're done with your thing. So hopefully you get a sense for the degree of interdependence on the task, and how that task work affects the outcome tends to drive what the right team structures can be. Now, how a team gets put together, what its composition is, inevitably ends up being highly variable because you can't always control exactly who's on your team. You often don't have that kind of luxury. And, it just, it happens, of course, that if you get a team of nothing but highly conscientious, smart people that are aligned, okay? If you got the best team of the hardest workers, the smartest people, and boy, do they work together. Okay, that's great. You got an ideal team. But that's just really hard to do. Especially when you have, only so many people and you got a whole bunch of different teams you got to make out of them. You don't end up usually with the dream team all the time. You don't always necessarily, a team of nothing but high conscientious people might not actually innovate. And maybe you actually want the team to innovate in how they work together. And as I said before, a team that's working hard and really smart, but they don't get aligned, that's actually bad. And they can work at cross purposes and burn a bunch of money and time, arguing and going different ways. So the kinds of personalities you get, backgrounds, knowledge domain, levels of intelligence, degree of collaboration, how much conflict there is, and that sort of thing, that's highly variable. Because it's humans. And humans are complex. And that diversity that you get for all sorts of different people, and this diversity means lots and lots of stuff. This isn't just race and gender and the sort of the first places people think of when you hear that term, but this is all sorts of diversity, different backgrounds, different degrees of education, different affinities, different previous work experiences, the ways that personality gets manifest. All that diversity, all the different dimensions of individual human difference, that can bring strength, and it can also cause fault lines. So it can be silly fault lines, like these three people went to this college and these other people went to somewhere else, and you get this in-group, out-group subdivision within your own team, and you end up with conflict and lack of trust because this thing manifests based upon how your team composition worked out. You can there's lots of ways that teams can go astray, and some of it has to do with the failure to actually achieve a unified in-group, because some other dimensional elements or whatever that was brought that maybe not have been an issue until the team encountered some external thing, like extra pressure to perform, or all of a sudden we didn't have that much money to get our project done. That can make these fault lines emerge across dimensions of difference. So diversity can be, when done properly, can really be a source of strength. Get wisdom of the crowd. You explore different topologies, so to speak, in terms of looking at all sorts of different problem sets, and to come up with different solution sets, because you have all these different perspectives. That can be fantastic, but you can also have it go astray. So this is just about human difference. Okay, so team processes, that's a thing that gets studied by industrial and organizational psychology a lot. And so team processes include things like task conflict, which is where you've got some sort of disagreement over how to perform the work, or at the task level. So what tasks need to be performed, or what's the best way to do that task. And then you get relationship conflict, which manifests itself in all sorts of ways that should be intuitively familiar. People don't get along for various reasons. You have different degrees of trust. You can have conflicts of interest, all sorts of things that end up making the interpersonal dynamic good or bad. So when it's bad, you end up with relationship conflict. And then you get conflicts of processes, which is just basically, this is more how you do the work. Maybe you agree on the task, but you completely at odds with the process by which you should go and complete it. This might be, we always use PCs and you guys use Macs, and we use this kind of software and use that kind of software, and our software has a workflow established with it that we follow, and that doesn't work at all with what you're doing. You're using a different workflow and it sucks, and you should use ours, and now you've got argument over how you're going to go about doing the work. Another team process that IO psychology studies is motivation. Motivation at the individual level and how it manifests in performance at a team. Another big thing is cohesion, which is really like a team cohesion is how close is this group, how well do they work together, and to some extent this is like a measure of the strength of the in-group identity across the different members, and then the shared fiction, of who we are, and what our purpose is, and all that sort of stuff. That's part of the what forms an in-group, and then shared goals. So we are the same people, and we want the same thing. Now you get really good team cohesion, and to the extent that you lose team cohesion, you're losing some aspect of that in-group uniformity, or some divergence in what, even though you might feel we're all part of the same group, you might think we need to go here, and other people might think we need to go there, and now you don't have shared goals. One of the things that improving cohesion can get you is a more cohesive group, a stronger in-group association identity within the team members, a stronger sense of shared goals. That can create a very positive peer pressure. In fact, as a reminder here, your leader, your manager, your supervisor saying you need to get this done. If you don't get this done, you'll get a poor performance rating, or if you don't get this done, you're not going to get a promotion, or if you really don't get this done, you might not work here anymore. That'd be like an extreme thing. But your manager or your teacher, or even just, your parents, when they're saying, you need to get this done, that's one kind of motivation, or at least to the extent that is a motivation. It's hierarchically driven, it's power dynamic driven, and that's different than the pressure you feel to follow the norms of your in-group, to not let your brother or sister down, to be in the trenches with somebody that you trust, and that you have shared identity and shared purpose and shared goals. The desire not to let somebody down ends up being extraordinarily powerful, and it's not something that organizations are great at tapping into. They're good. A good organization is good at tapping into that, but the real power of so positive peer pressure, the desire to do right, by somebody that you're very close with. That's an amazing power that humans have. It's extraordinarily motivating, and it's part of the whole motivation to follow norms. It's not only that, but that's a thing that a highly cohesive group can use to great success. Again, provided people are pointing in the right direction. Okay, so teams versus individuals. A team is made up of individuals, but there's sort of different challenges associated with, say, things like motivation at the team level versus the individual level. And like one thing we'll just touch on is this concept of social loafing. Social loafing is where you have somebody that you just picture tug of war. You get two groups in tug of war, and say there's 5 people on both sides tugging. If somebody that's on one side might be like, yeah, I'm not going to pull that hard. I don't want to hurt myself. Now they're loafing. They're not contributing in an equal amount. Now, if at the same time, if you've got a tug of war and it's 2 people against each other, I'm doing a tug of war with you. Whether I'm trying or not, and it's difficult for me to loaf, or I'm just going to lose. But if I'm part of a group of 5 or 10 people, and you're part of a group of 5 or 10 people, it's really hard to tell. And so, to what extent do I feel cohesion? To what extent do I feel shared goals, and in a sense to not let my team down, sort of thing? Or to what extent do I feel my own personal need to do my best? Those things can affect the degree to which I choose to put my all or not into my part of the tug of war. And so social loafing becomes a thing where somebody might not work as hard than they would have if they worked alone. And when you talk about engagement in the workplace, I mean, social loafing is a huge social loafing, or this concept of, say, not getting the maximum engagement out of a human being in a workplace. So that's another $1 trillion problem, in the sense that the actual amount of energy, time, commitment, sacrifice that a human gives to their workplace is almost always less than what they're capable of. And that does not mean that therefore they're somehow stealing from their organization. I mean, not at all. I mean, there's a give and take. There's a supply and demand in terms of of what you're going to get done and what you get paid. That's different than lying about what you're doing and going to sleep on the job, that sort of thing. This is more of a heart and soul kind of thing. So social loafing can be truly be I'm going to go take a nap, or I'm going to watch Netflix because nobody can see my computer monitor. That there's an element of it where, yeah, you're clearly not doing what you're being paid to do, and at some level you're acting in a fraudulent manner. But there's lots of things that it's like, is it social loafing when you know you could be working harder? And this is really one of those things that organizations that can figure this out, and some of it is just hire certain people that are insanely self-motivated, but a lot of it is what the organization can do to make a really cohesive team, to make the goals that the organization is working for really, really compelling. You can get so much more out of a really cohesive, highly motivated team, where nobody's loafing because nobody wants to, because everybody's all in. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary what a team like that can do. It's also extraordinarily hard to just try to create it. Okay, we're gonna finish this lecture with just talking in a general way about formal and informal hierarchies. And another benefit of those of you who are watching the video, don't expect much of formal and informal hierarchies for these explicit slides to be on the test. So we'll just breeze through this to get a sense for what do we mean by formal hierarchy. So if you go back in time, and then in certain parts of the world still, we have this classic thing that's like be called like a dominance hierarchy, and that's where it's clearly defined. It's the power centralizes as you go up. Things separate into various functions. And the power is clearly manifest, and it gets its way, and it's all top down. So that's a dominance hierarchy pecking order. Modern organizations aren't really dominance hierarchies. There's a dominance in the sense that there's authority, and then there's power associated with that authority. But a typical modern organization is better looked at sort of this dominance / competence hierarchy, in the sense that most hierarchies in modern organizations, you sort of earn your hierarchy through your competence. You don't earn your hierarchy because you got the biggest stick, the biggest gun, or the hardest punch. Like you might in a baboon troop or a wolf pack or whatever. It's not about physical dominance in a modern organization. In the older organizations, it wasn't necessarily about strength as much as it was about power, and some of that power was baked into the culture with like class, and that sort of thing. And probably the most ugliest manifestation would be something like chattel slavery. But in a modern organization, in a modern, certainly Western organization, the assumption within a hierarchy is those things are earned largely through competence. Now, ownership's a little bit different. The person that's in charge of your organization might be a completely incompetent son of a bitch, and that could be because they're the errant son of the founder, so who doesn't know anything, but they're in charge, and they're just intolerable. That does happen because of the way ownership tends to work. But by and large, modern organizations are more accurately viewed as competence hierarchies. And you get a mix of where the power goes, and you've got certainly top down that happens, but you get a lot of middle out, which is to say at the middle layers you have people that are given a lot of authority and responsibility to make decisions, and then they are sort of communicate up as long as they stay within a budget, certain amount of scope. They're in charge. And then they communicate upwards so that the higher levels kind of know what's going on and have the ability to occasionally, steer a little bit with some top down. And then you have bottom up in modern organizations, which is the people at the working level, or right at the sort of front lines of the organization. They're where the customer is, or where the product gets made, or whatever. Oftentimes there's a lot of decision making that's allowed at that level too. So it really isn't about dominance all the way down, not in a modern, effective organization. It's a complete balance of decision rights up and down the hierarchy, and the decision rights are based on where does it make the most sense for the decisions to be made, and then the people at the different levels are hopefully at those levels because they've demonstrated the most competence to be at that level, and that includes the lowest or the frontline level. There are things that like sales, and there are people that could be in the middle or the top that would be really crappy at sales, and so competence isn't necessarily just a vertical thing. It isn't about you get better at when you go up. It's more of you are competent at that middle layer, you are competent at that high layer, you're competent at the working level. Okay, so then there's this other thing we won't get into too much, but there's other ways to structure an organization. There's this thing called this matrix organization, and that's actually where you have like two or more intersecting hierarchies, where you might have you might slice a company in two dimensions, for instance, which is you're responsible for a product line. Okay, and you've got a group that works for you, and you all make this sort of product. And there's this other person; they've got another product line, but there's another and you all work for the person that's in charge of all the products. But there might be another boss who is responsible for the customer relationship, and so you might have 10 customers. So you might report to the person that's responsible for all the products, and you might also report to a particular individual that, or more than one, that's responsible for customers. And so now you have multiple bosses. So it's complicated. It's difficult to manifest and make it work well. But there are certain times in which it's compelling to try this as an organization, and some organizations have been successful at matrix organizations. Typically it doesn't exceed two types of managers, and sometimes you have equal managers, sometimes you have a solid and a dotted line manager, or sometimes you call it your matrix manager. We won't get into it, but just know that that exists. And then you can get sort of some new stuff, which I'm a little skeptical of, but in certain circumstances there are places that have made this work, and it's a sort of lattice where you've got a bunch of a nodal structure that has hierarchies and networks sort of within it, and it sort of comes and goes, where people can choose their own team they want to work on, but they also choose you. And that once you sort of get consensus that this group's going to work on this thing, you pick the leader based on how they naturally emerge. There's some tech companies, some software companies that have played with this, and some argue that they've been quite successful at it. This is not a normal thing. Maybe we'll figure out how to do it well in the future, and this will be the way almost everything is. But I highly doubt it. But just know that there are alternative creative ways to structure organizations. And then I want to mention distance, hierarchical distance. I've said this before, but just understand again that the sort of power separation, the cultural separation between layers of hierarchy is different across different cultures and different types of hierarchies. And typically in the West, we tend to have short hierarchical distance. I mean, the military would be an example where there's quite a bit of hierarchical distance. And a lot of Eastern cultures still have, certainly compared to Western cultures, typically more hierarchical distance. And this is how much deference, how much respect is expected when you're communicating or behaving upward. And to what extent can you be imposing or indifferent or disrespectful when you're going down a hierarchy. And in the West, that's typically, certainly in America, where things our value system is egalitarian, that every individual is worth the same as every other individual. Too much distance in hierarchy tends to be run counter to that value system. So it's now extremely common in even giant modern corporations. The CEO goes by their first name, and it isn't always all about names, but that's the easiest the way to kind of view hierarchical distance. And there's this thing, span of control. I mentioned this before, and this is really how many direct reports you have. And you might have, if you have, so what does that mean? Number of direct reports affects management optionality. That's a good word salad I did there. But really this means, like, if you got 5 direct reports, you have the ability to dive fairly deep into what your people are working on, be participative in what they're doing. You make a lot of decisions if you feel if it's necessary to do that. But if you have 50 direct reports, you're extremely constrained by how much you can actually know what they're doing. So your options of the things you can do as a leader are constrained by the number of direct reports you have. And and flatter, having like 6, 7 direct reports is more common, at least in corporate America right now. But to get to where you have like 10 or 20 or 30 direct reports, you need to have a lot of structure in place, or you have to have a lot of highly capable people that are working for you that don't actually need much direction. All right, let's finish this off by just, we talked about formal hierarchies. Let's talk about what are the informal hierarchies that exist in organizations. Well, competence hierarchies, you hopefully have a formal hierarchy that's based on competence. Certainly not hopefully not on pure dominance. But there's all sorts of competence hierarchies, and really, whether somebody's good at something or not, at least if you've worked with them long enough. And typically, well, at least what you'd expect to see is that how competent you are at work tasks should be should correlate to, how your job grade is. If you're a junior or a middle or a senior, you should expect to see growing task competence in that regard. But humans typically tune to a much finer gradient of competence and more dimensionality of competence. So you might have an accounting 1 and an accounting 2 and a senior accountant. But if you are in the accounting department or you're regularly dealing with accountants, you'll tune into all sorts of ways in which these 6 different senior accountants are actually quite a bit different in their competence across many dimensions. Awareness of basic accounting, ability to navigate through the software tools that your company might use, the ability to make fast decisions, how hard they work, all the various dimensions that you might tune into because it's relevant to you, that you can look at as a competence dimension. We have very fine-tuned abilities to assess ourselves and assess others along competence dimensions. But there's also other hierarchies. There's prestige or status hierarchies, and that's like how much money you have, how good looking you are, how charismatic you are, those sorts of things. Those often manifest in things like how big of a friend group do you have, how popular are you are. These are performative and it's become displays, like how nice of a car you have, bigger house, what kind of cars you drive, how strong are you, all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of ways in which that we experience hierarchies, and this is just sort of a product of being a social species that's inherently competitive. To some extent, we're a tournament species in the sense that we compete for status often to be able to get the best mates. If you want to look at it from an evolutionary lens, so hierarchies become this sort of way we frame the world and the way we inevitably make comparisons. But there's other, think in an organization here, there's another type of hierarchy called the access hierarchy, and this is where you've got gatekeepers, the people that can get you in somewhere or can open up something to you. This doesn't have to mean something physical, but you want to get access to some information, or you literally want to get physical access to the people who control that. Often that comes with a sense of power, and sometimes there's gradients to it. So there's information hierarchies. There's all sorts of specialty knowledge out there, and the people that know that specialty knowledge when it's needed, when it's scarce and in demand, there can be a power associated with that. And those people that have the information or degrees of information can create something along the lines of an information hierarchy. And then, of course, there's networks. And I've mentioned this before, but as networks naturally emerge, over time, if that network is stable and it's growing, often within that network will come dimensions of things that show up as hierarchies. So you get these nascent or emergent or new hierarchies that come out of networks. And that's actually an interesting thing from a career standpoint, is oftentimes a future hierarchy, a future area that will actually need to be have dedicated people to work on it. If you write software, you might find there's this network of people that are dealing with this obscure problem or this new type of software approach that almost nobody knows how to do. But you get together in your organization of the people who also face those things, and you make like a network. Well, it depends on what it is, but 5 years later, that thing might, the way the markets are shifting or technology is shifting, that might actually become something that's really important. It might become part of your product, and so that knowledge that that you built up in that network becomes a benefit for you, and then your level of skill inside it becomes hierarchical. And so you can end up with a hierarchy that emerges, and you can find yourself maybe at a high level of competence in that hierarchy of what had started as a network that might turn into a job promotion opportunity or whatever. So watch emerging networks as opportunities for future hierarchies. Not always, but and make sure you understand the subtlety of what I'm saying. Okay, well, that was a lecture, and we talked about for Chapter 10, Structures of Organizations, and how these structures can be hierarchical, these structures can be around networks, these structures can be around processes. And we talked about bureaucracy, but how bureaucracy is also balanced with the human side of things, bureaucracy versus autonomy. We got in a little bit about how an organization goes about trying to enable autonomy in a way that doesn't cause chaos, and with how self-management and self-managed teams become important. And then we talked about the different types of teams in organizations. And then finally, we talked about formal and informal hierarchies. So next lecture, to finish off Chapter 10 before the bonus lecture, we're going to talk about culture of organizations. And we're going to talk about, well, what do we mean by that? What is organizational culture? What are the different dimensions of an organizational culture? What are the broad different types? How does one go about socialization to an organization, which is like an acculturation? How does one adapt to the culture of an organization? And then what is organizational development? How do organizations attempt to change themselves? Okay, that is the end of lecture 28, and we will see you for lecture 29.